Welcome to Las Vegas, the Wild West, where the doctors and scientists wear cowboy boots that light up neon. Do let me know if anyone thinks any seizures might be triggered by these, because I have different settings and I can actually turn them to be static. But that was a true story. I moved to Vegas just over a year ago, and one of my fears has been a scorpion in my house because I live nowhere near the Strip, of course. I live in the mountains. And 2 nights ago, while I was watching TV, the thing that I feared the most actually happened. You have to hear about this because everyone has to hear about this now. But a very light brown colored scorpion that kind of like camouflaged with my floor ran very fast towards my feet. And I sprang up. Thankfully, I had slippers on and I whacked it twice. And then all the adrenaline went and I just screamed into the void. And it was about 11 p.m., so I did the most responsible thing, which was call all of my neighbors. And they all came over with brooms, Lysol cameras to film everything and to help me discard it. But now onto the matter of today, the fact that I would choose to wear a Halloween costume, even though I don't celebrate Halloween, that was half queen and half reptile is because I grew up a conspiracy theorist. In England, in my very tight-knit immigrant community, we believed many different conspiracy theories, and one of them was that Queen Elizabeth, and in fact the entire royal family, we were convinced, were reptilian shapeshifters. This is a conspiracy theory which was resurrected, of course, with the death of Queen Elizabeth to the point that PolitiFact had to write about it. And in case you're thinking, this is so wild, she's so crazy, welcome, because 12 million Americans believe that lizard people run our country. And it sounds wild, and of course I outgrew that conspiracy theory by about the age of 14 or 15, and not everybody does. If you remember this tragedy from Christmas Day of 2020, when this very disturbed 63-year-old man blew up a not insignificant amount of downtown Nashville. Investigations found that he believed deeply anti-government sentiments, and he believed, in fact, that the government was run by half reptile, half humanoids. He, of course, detonated his van in front of an AT&T hub in downtown Nashville. So along with taking down about 50 buildings, he also crippled cellular and internet systems for about 2 states for a few days over the Christmas period. So of course, we know that these conspiracy theories are rife. We know that they have real life manifestations. And when people say, like, you're a scientist now, you're a debunker, you study the spread of anti-vaccine movements and anti-science movements, how could you, Seema, of all people, have believed that Prince Charles, or now King Charles, was a reptile? And you know, now that I teach people like how to effectively debunk, how to have conversations that help you deprogram those who have fallen into QAnon, for example, or those who refuse to get vaccinated, one of the things I always come back to is this idea of you need to have compassion and empathy in those conversations. Way easier said than done, I get it, and I live it because my family still believes some conspiracy theories. My family, despite the fact that I'm a public health doctor, still refuse to get some of their vaccines. But the way that I explain to people that I'm able to bring compassion and empathy and understanding into those conversations is, one, I was one of them. I believed in conspiracy theories as a child, okay, but still, I was convinced by some of them. This is the other reason. Anyone know what this map represents? Yeah, so it's the British Empire at the height of its power. And as a child, similar to it, this was a map that was hung on my slightly older cousin's bedroom wall. So every day we'd see this, it was pink instead of red, it was a slightly different projection, which is a whole different conspiracy theory to get into. But those red countries are countries that were colonized by the Brits. And we grew up in England, and we're like, but look, England is just that tiny little landmass up in the north. Like, how in the heck did they manage to do that? And of course, our family was impacted by British colonization. The partition happened in India, this horrific genocide. The Brits stole over 45 trillion pounds from our economy over hundreds of years. So to us, the fact that this was true, this had happened, it was so absurd, and no one at school talked about it. It wasn't in the textbooks. Our teachers didn't ever talk about this stuff. That to us led to conspiratorial belief. It made sense that the Queen might be a reptile. One, how on earth did they do this? They must be superhuman. I mean, it's superhuman audacity, that's for sure. But there was just so much conspiracy built into things that were real that then, of course, we were duped by actual conspiracy theories. Of course, like I said, I grew out of believing in that bunk and became a debunker in chief. I went to medical school in the UK, and then just over 10 years ago, I moved to the US to serve as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. This is a cadre of physicians and scientists who work for the federal government, housed in the CDC and within the military, in the public health service. And as an epidemic intelligence service officer, you're sent out, you're deployed wherever there's an outbreak anywhere in the world. And your job is to figure out what on earth is spreading, who is it spreading to, why is it being spread, and how can we stop the contagion? Speaking of contagion, if you've seen this movie, which of course became really popular all over again in 2020 when COVID happened, this film came out in 2011, right when I joined the Epidemic Intelligence Service, right when I moved from England to America. And if you recall, Kate Winslet in this movie plays the job that I did. She was an epidemic intelligence service officer. Obviously, a very Hollywood version of it, but there was some similarities. I did a YouTube video for Wired comparing the Contagion Hollywood response to a pandemic to the real-life botched response to a pandemic. So there were some similarities. It was during my tenure as a government disease detective that I had my aha moment. And it was an aha moment born out of sheer frustration. So look, every given week, I would be sent to a different hot zone, a different place where a disease was spreading and killing people, maiming people. And really early on, I saw it's never just a virus that's spreading. It's never just a bacteria. It's never just a pathogen. In tandem, spreading alongside the disease are medical myths and health hoaxes and conspiracy theories about the disease, about its treatments, about vaccines, about me as someone who showed up with a badge saying I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. It made it almost impossible to do my job. So I would go to these places, far-flung places probably no Brit has ever been to, and would go back to the mothership in Atlanta and say, we've got a big problem. I know we in public health worship vaccines. Vaccines are like our religion, but what use are they if people are refusing to get vaccinated? And over and over and over again, I'd be told, calm down. Look at overall vaccination coverage rates. And I was like, I just don't understand this mentality. We're epidemiologists. Clearly, I'm being sent to places where there's an outbreak because, sure, the overall vaccination rate for a country might be great, but all you need is one area, one pocket where vaccination rates are low, and you see children die from whooping cough. I was so pissed off. I trained in England, right, and learned about measles and whooping cough from textbooks. I'd never seen a child with measles. I had never heard in real life the whoop and the suffocating sound of a child with whooping cough until I moved to America. And not to say that, oh, that was just happening here around the same time. It was happening in the UK too. It was happening all over the world, this resurgence of vaccine-preventable diseases. So my aha moment was, we are, within our public health community, within our science community, just choosing to delude ourselves and feel kind of cozy, like, yay, we have vaccines and they're gonna save the world. And in reality, I was seeing that kids in America were dying of whooping cough, which is a horrific way to die, even though we had vaccines that could prevent that suffering. So I left the government and I went to train as a journalist, because I thought, okay, it's information that's being spread here. It's very dangerous information. Maybe journalists are the people that can debunk this stuff, really understand how to get a compelling narrative out there, really tackle the conspiracy theories head on. So this is me when I was a reporter at the Dallas Morning News. In 2014, Ebola had not yet arrived in Dallas, if you remember that. But I discovered on this day that Ebola was already in Texas and had been in Texas for a very long time. So here I was in a laboratory on Galveston Island, which didn't make sense to me because why would you build a facility that houses anthrax and yellow fever and monkeys infected with Ebola on an island that gets hit by really bad weather? But anyway, they say that they euthanize the animals and they vacate before hurricane season occurs. I did not go during hurricane season, but it was amazing to me that there was all this hysteria at the time around Ebola perhaps arriving in the US any day soon. And I was like, it's already here in the deep freeze and it's already in these monkeys who are infected. So I was writing a lot about Ebola in 2014. I just left the government, but I was kind of having one of those like, oh my God, what kind of career decision did I just make? I should be in West Africa helping patients with Ebola. That's what I was trained to do. What am I doing here as a science journalist, writing about it from a cozy distance? And then a few weeks later, this happened. I was still unpacking my boxes in Dallas, and we had a man who arrived from Liberia. This is Thomas Eric Duncan, who sadly died of Ebola in 2014. I don't know if you remember all of that saga, but it was at that time when the CDC was telling every hospital in the US, look, this outbreak has been going on for long enough in West Africa that we are going to see cases here at some point. It's just such a big outbreak. And so the week before he came to Dallas, I had done a story with NBC News from inside a hospital to say, look how ready hospitals in Dallas are in case somebody walks in with a travel history to West Africa and a fever. And many hospitals were ready. Sadly, Thomas Eric Duncan went to a hospital that was not, and they misdiagnosed him with acute sinusitis, gave him antibiotics, which was the wrong thing to do anyway, and sent him home. He then came back. But in the meantime, fear had spread, right? Like what else spreads like a virus? There was all of this fear. We had calls to the newsroom from Black people living in Dallas saying employers had said to them, don't come in, you might have Ebola. You look like you're from Africa. Like the ignorance was, was already there and it was so deep, but it became like rushing to the surface. And then of course you had the high level discourse on cable television. Is Ebola the ISIS of biological agents? And I worked for CNN at that time as a medical analyst, but this is the kind of conversation we were having about this disease. And in fact, of course, trusted Fox News did a poll and found that many Americans felt like, Ebola and ISIS were kind of an equal threat, and actually Ebola was a greater threat to US citizens and to democracy. So let's look at some of the misinformation that spread at that time and that I began tracking in 2014. Here are some of the things that we saw were spreading about Ebola. That the Ebola vaccine only works on white people. Oh, well, I'm screwed. Ebola patients have risen from the dead. Ebola could be airborne in some cases. Now, this is one that gets you into tricky territory because in scientific experiments in the lab, Ebola has been purposefully aerosolized and infected monkeys in that way. So somebody could read that in a journal, and even though we haven't seen airborne transmission of Ebola between humans, I was inundated at the time and called a liar because why aren't you admitting that we're all gonna get Ebola in Dallas because this one man was here, because clearly Ebola is airborne. It wasn't. Health officials might inject Ebola patients with lethal substances. There will be no 2016 election. There will be complete anarchy because of Ebola. We had myths about the US government owning a patent on the Ebola virus itself. And interestingly, as I've started looking at trends over the years, been mapping trends in misinformation and disinformation about disease, for some reason Tulane University comes up very often, and I'm not sure why it's at the heart of many of these conspiracy theories, but it happened with Ebola, and one of the theories spreading at the time was that Tulane University scientists had gone to West Africa to do experiments and accidentally unleashed Ebola into the wild. And this is what had sparked the outbreak. That terrorists will purposely contract Ebola and spread it around was another one. The new iPhone is infecting people with Ebola. There was also misinformation that there's a suspected Ebola case in Kansas City, and I'll come back to this idea of other Ebola outbreaks in a second. And also this idea that Ebola has been detected in hair extensions. Where do these come from? But these are misinformation, right? So false information often spread by people who don't know it's false, and oftentimes the intention behind it is to inform, genuinely. They may not realize that it's actually false information. On the other hand, you have this. Disinformation. Breaking Ebola outbreak in Atlanta, estimated 145 people infected so far since doctors carrying the disease were flown in from Africa. So what had happened here? Yahoo News' official, verified Twitter account had been hacked. And who had hacked it? People working inside this office building in St. Petersburg in Russia. A Kremlin-funded organization. I hope many of you, if not all of you, have heard of it. It's often referred to as the agency or the Internet Research Agency. The people working here have seeded disinformation campaigns since at least 2014, linked to everything from Ebola outbreaks to Zika, to seeding disinformation to fragment the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and in Europe. Disinformation campaigns against the organizers of the Women's March. Remember that happened after Trump's election, the big New York Times report on this a few weekends ago that was really, really good. But it's not always the kind of disinformation you think it's going to be. So sometimes it's that blatant, there's an Ebola outbreak in Atlanta. That kind of disinformation really has the potential to cripple a health system quite quickly. You have enough people who are freaking out, turn up to enough urgent cares and ERs in Atlanta, and you can't care for those who are having heart attacks and strokes. So with the disinformation, the false information that's spread with the intention of causing harm. But you also have this tactic, really interesting, also linked back to bad actors in Russia, where they were using and unleashing Twitter bots and trolls, not to say, hey, vaccines cause autism or that kind of nonsense. They were just stoking debate and asking questions and kind of seeding a dispute where we know that there wasn't supposed to be a dispute because the science had established that vaccines are safe and effective. So that's another one of their tactics. Really interesting to get deep into their strategies. A lot of what they do when they want to dismantle a democracy and interrupt in a country's peace is they'll do a lot of analysis on what's already broken in that country, what fissures already exist. Racism is a problem. People are trying to fight this problem. How can we deepen that existing chasm in that society? And then after making that diagnosis, they do a really, really stellar job of appearing as if they're just other concerned Americans who are saying, but I have these questions about vaccines and I don't think they work. It's not always health and science, misinformation and disinformation that is spread. I've since widened my net to look more widely at disinformation that's not just to do with science, and I'll explain why in a moment. In a nutshell, it's because it's all so connected. These ideologies that are anti-government and also anti-Muslim and also anti-vaccine. This happened a few years ago. This is a shot from Westminster Bridge in the heart of London, right next to Westminster, the Houses of Westminster. A terrible terrorist attack had just happened. This man had stabbed a number of people. This is a real-life photo. No photoshopping happened, nothing's been doctored. But the narrative that was attached to this picture was that this Muslim woman wearing a hijab obviously doesn't give a shit about terrorism victims, because look at her, she's looking at her phone and just walking past. I mean, when I look at her face, I'm like, she looks distressed to me, but okay. But now we know the story, which is that she had assisted somebody, and she was now trying to get herself and somebody safely away from this situation, get them home. She was on her phone because her family knew where she was and were panicking. They knew a stabbing rampage had happened right where their loved one was. But this is the narrative that was spread by Texas Lone Star. Was this person actually anywhere in Texas? No, they were a few thousand miles away in that building I just showed you. They were part of the Internet Research Agency, again, spreading this narrative that went viral. They seeded it, but many thousands, perhaps millions believed it, or at least believed it enough to spread it. So on the one side, you've got this MP inside the Houses of Parliament who is assisting one of the victims. He's known to be Christian. And of course, the narrative that was spread by this group was Muslims bad, Christians great. It's not always bad actors in Russia, though. I want to tell you a story that really, really pisses me off. This happened a few years ago in Minnesota. The worst measles outbreak in that state's history in 30 years happened just a few years ago. As I mentioned, measles is not a mild childhood illness. It sends kids to the ICU. It can cause lifelong learning disabilities and learning delays and also deafness, among other issues. What happened about 10 years prior to this outbreak was Somali parents in Minnesota had an inkling that rates of autism were higher among their kids than among their kids' white friends. So, parents get concerned about all kinds of things, and that's valid. They took their concerns to the public health department, and the public health department said, we're going to look into this. We hear your concerns. We're going to check. Is it true that Somali kids have higher rates of developmental delay than white kids in Minnesota? While the public health department is doing its epidemiologic analysis, who swoops in to Minnesota? Andrew Wakefield. And other disinformation, anti-vaccine disinformation spreading groups, like I think it was the Organic Consumers Association, which sounded like so wholesome and like, eat your broccoli. But what they were doing was not promoting broccoli at all. They were holding closed-door town halls with concerned Somali parents, and they had armed guards at the doors of these town halls so that I couldn't go in, reporters couldn't go in, you probably couldn't go in because you all look so skeptical. And what they said during these town halls was, we hear your concerns, and you know what? You're right. Somali kids do have higher rates of autism, and do you know why? It's because you vaccinate them so much. You vaccinate them with MMR even more so than white kids in Minnesota. Over the course of a few years, the vaccination rate for MMR plummeted because the Somali parents, their fear, their panic was exploited and preyed upon. And then we had this horrific measles outbreak. Of course, right? You need MMR rates to not drop that much, and here they dropped a lot. Look at that. And kids were in the ICU. And I remember some of the reporting from this was horrific. It was Somali parents who had fled refugee camps in the Horn of Africa where they'd seen people with measles, where they'd lost siblings to measles. And they said things like, I didn't think this would happen to our child in America. So these are just to kind of get rid of any notion that the bad actors are always outside. Well, no, they're often here. One of the things that I study is how information is contagious. I also study the spread of news deserts and information deserts across the US to understand how do they impact our understanding of science, our belief in science, and our beliefs and actions around public health. And one of the things that I used to use was this calculation back when I was a disease detective. All it is actually more simple than it might look there. It's a mathematical model into which you plug assumptions about an outbreak. It's the exact kind of models we use right now to say COVID is here, it's infected this many people over this amount of time, and where might it spread to? Over what course of time might this outbreak expand? So those are the models I used to use to track disease. When I became an information scholar, it blew my mind that communication researchers use the exact same calculations, the exact same model to map not the spread of a flu outbreak in a school, although yes, you can use a model for that, but this, they use the exact same models to track the spread of a tweet, a rumor, a meme that was anti-science, that was anti-COVID. And look, they look the same. The dots represent people, the lines represent connections between people. Back to this one, it's a flu outbreak in an American school. This one, it's a rumor, a piece of BS about COVID spreading not within the confines of a school, but spreading across oceans and across countries because of how connected we are. And I'm sure you've heard about super spreaders at this point. I used to have to explain it a lot more. But in the same way that you can use that same model to track the spread of disease, you can use it to track the spread of a tweet, a meme, or rumor, misinformation. you have super spreaders of disease, people who are more spread on average the infection to more people than just a regular person. You also have super spreaders of misinformation and disinformation. But you also have another parallel, which is alongside the super spreaders, you have stiflers. So in the sense of COVID, a stifler might be that person who says, I have COVID, I'm going to quarantine, I'm going to stay at home, I'm going to really make sure I don't go out until I test negative, for example. A stifler, when it comes to information contagion, is that person who says the bunk stops with me. I'm going to make sure that I am savvy enough to spot fact from fiction. I'm not going to retweet this. I'm going to alert people to the fact that this is fake information. So at this point, I became an infodemiologist studying the spread of epidemics, but also misinfodemics as well. And looking again at other epidemics too, this one was Zika, which of course came to the US a little while after Ebola. You can see some of the misinformation that was spread, that there were genetically modified mosquitoes that were the real cause of the microcephaly that the Zika virus was causing. I won't read all of them, but you can see there's these trends that occur. There's so many parallels. You could almost switch out the name of the disease sometimes. Like it could be Ebola, it could be COVID, it could be Zika, it could be HIV, and yet the myths that persist are very often falling along particular lines, preying on our panic, preying on a wide-scale lack of science literacy, which is really one of the things that we need to work on. So this happened too, and this I included because I was having coffee with I was at the Dallas Morning News. I was having coffee with Lauren Silverman, who was the local NPR science reporter. We were just sitting in a lovely downtown coffee shop, and of course our phone started to blow up, and it was our editor saying, come back to the newsroom, what are you doing? Of course, the first case of sexually transmitted Zika had occurred in the US, and where else would it occur? It had to be Dallas. It always has to be Dallas. So again, when there's there's that novelty factor, that makes a situation rife for the birth of misinformation and disinformation and allows it to spread like wildfire. None of this is new, though. And of course, I've been tracking the spread of misinformation and disinformation about science for just over a decade, but it's been around forever. And these are images I'm going to show you from the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. There were anti-maskers then, too. I don't know if that makes you feel any better or worse. I don't know. But they were in full effect there. This is a picture from 1919. The only captions or information I can find about it, it was a woman using the high-tech anti-flu machine of the time. No one can seem to say exactly how it worked. But my point is, none of it is new. We've lived in the problem space for a long time. Now what I am focusing on is solutions. This is a widespread problem, but there are evidence-based ways that we can immunize people against falling for BS. There's this man. Anyone recognize him or know the story of how vaccination technology really came to the US? This was in the early 1700s. There was a terrible smallpox epidemic in Boston, yet another one. These outbreaks were so bad that 1 in 7 people who was infected would die. The rest of them would be disfigured, disabled, and in immense pain. There was a Puritan minister in Boston at the time called Cotton Mather. Now, Mather had been gifted a person, an enslaved person, as people did back then, and this was one of the enslaved people who worked for Mather. His name was Onesimus. He came from Africa, and as the smallpox outbreak was spreading, Cotton Mather said to Onesimus, have you ever had this disease? Look at people falling like flies. You ever seen it? You ever had it? And Onesimus gave this kind of cryptic answer, which was, yes, I have had it, but I have not had it. And then he began to explain to Mather that back in Africa, he had been scraped on his arm, and the pus from the pustule of a person with smallpox had been rubbed into his wound. He became a little bit sick, but not very sick, and then he became well again. And so Mather started to be like, there might be something to this. So the technology of variolation came around. That name comes from the fact that smallpox is known as variola. Mather said to the people of Boston, we have a way of making sure we all don't fall like flies and don't end up disfigured and disabled. And what did they do? They threw bricks and fire through Mather's window, because how dare he believe about science coming from an enslaved black man? Needless to say, the technology, the idea of it did spread. Jenner gets all of the credit, not the enslaved black man who brought the technology and the idea to the US. But what I want to leave you with is quickly this idea of inoculation theory. It was mentioned a little bit yesterday, but in the 1960s, a Harvard social psychologist called Bill McGuire took this idea that if we give someone a flu shot and we expose them to a small and weakened dose of flu, and it then prepares their body for a robust response when they're actually exposed to the real thing, why can't we do the same with a lie? And so this idea of pre-bunking and inoculation theory came about in the 60s, and this is my biggest beef. It's been proven to work. Why have we not used it more in public health? Now, thankfully, there are people who are gamifying the technology, the idea of inoculation theory. You can play the bad news game. You can play the cranky uncle game. This is a map that shows that there's a duration of cognitive immunity, like a mental resilience, a mental immune system that develops after you have been taught about inoculation theory, after you've been taught about incoming BS, and after you've been taught stuff like this. Here are the techniques of science denial. When you break it down like this, and you're not just talking about the topic, you're not just talking about climate change or vaccines, but you're saying, put the topic to the side, let's talk about the strategies being used to spread this BS. And by the way, it's been used by big tobacco and big oil and big sugar and everyone trying to seed disinformation. You can actually break down this taxonomy. This comes from John Cook, an amazing researcher in Australia at Monash University. With this technology, with this teaching, you actually give people much more widespread mental immunity, cognitive resilience against falling for BS. This is my mission in life. I wrote this op-ed recently. Now California has passed a bill that can strip doctors of their medical licenses if they spread COVID disinformation. It was a long time coming, but we needed some kind of legislation like this. Really quickly, I'll end by saying that it's not just about personal responsibility and just teaching ourselves and others. We need platforms to take responsibility and to deplatform people like these weirdos who spread 65% of COVID disinformation among them. And I've written a book about this and made it my mission. It's called What the Fact. I'm going to be doing signings later, but very much so it's about showing the good news part of this, which is, yes, the viral spread of misinformation and disinformation. It can feel overwhelming, but I promise you there are evidence-based tools and strategies we can arm ourselves with that can stop this information contagion. I'll be signing books in Laughlin. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go through these really quickly. And I hope you'll join me there. Thank you all so much for your attention.